Imagine a world where the sound of approaching horses meant the end of kingdoms, where entire cities surrendered without a single arrow being fired, and where one man's name alone was enough to freeze armies in fear. This was the era of the Mongol storm, the rise of Genghis Khan, a leader who transformed scattered nomadic tribes into the most terrifying war machine history had ever witnessed, expanding faster than any empire before him, crushing resistance with brutal efficiency, rewriting borders as if they were lines drawn in sand. The Mongol army did not fight like traditional forces. They moved like lightning, thousands of skilled horse archers attacking in coordinated waves, pretending to retreat only to lure enemies into traps, striking supply lines, destroying morale before swords even clashed. And this psychological warfare was often more powerful than their weapons, because fear spread faster than their horses ever could. Kingdom after kingdom fell. China, Central Asia, Persia, each victory feeding the legend that the Mongols were unstoppable, divinely favored, impossible to defeat. And this belief itself became their greatest weapon, because many rulers surrendered before resistance even began, choosing survival over certain destruction. But no empire, no matter how vast, escapes the laws of reality. Distance weakens control, harsh climates exhaust soldiers, unfamiliar lands disrupt tactics, and enemies who survive begin to learn, adapt, and wait for the right moment to strike back. And as Mongol campaigns pushed further into territories unlike their open steppes, cracks slowly began forming beneath the surface of their dominance, small at first, almost invisible. But history is shaped by such cracks, because the same speed that built the empire also stretched it thin.
Supply routes grew longer. Commanders operated far from central authority. Local rebellions reignited the moment armies moved forward. And the myth of invincibility slowly transformed into a challenge that rival powers prepared themselves to answer. The Mongols were masters of open field warfare, but mountains, dense forests, fortified cities, and extreme weather began limiting their greatest advantage, mobility. And when mobility weakened, the fear factor weakened with it, because enemies realized the Mongols were not gods. They were men bound by terrain, hunger, fatigue, and miscalculations like any other army. And this realization marked the psychological shift that every empire eventually faces. The moment when opponents stop running and start resisting with strategy instead of panic. Over time, regional powers studied Mongol tactics, reinforced walls, improved cavalry training, and built alliances rather than standing alone, turning battles from one-sided slaughters into calculated confrontations. And while the Mongol Empire remained enormous and powerful, its expansion was no longer effortless. Victories demanded more resources, more planning, and higher risks, showing that the unstoppable force was finally meeting friction. History does not collapse empires in a single day. It erodes them through accumulated challenges. Leadership disputes after Genghis Khan's death, divisions among heirs, overextension of territory, and the growing confidence of former victims all work together like slow-moving tectonic plates beneath the surface, invisible in the moment but catastrophic over decades, proving that even the most feared conquerors cannot outrun the limits of geography, logistics, and human unity forever. The legacy of Genghis Khan did not end with sudden defeat, but with gradual transformation, his empire fragmenting into khanates, still powerful, yet no longer a single unstoppable storm. And this turning point in history reminds us that dominance built on speed and fear can conquer continents, but sustaining it requires stability, adaptation, and cohesion, qualities harder to maintain than winning battles. And in the end, the Mongol story becomes less about invincibility and more about the universal truth that every empire, no matter how legendary, eventually meets a force it cannot simply outrun: time itself. As the empire expanded beyond the familiar grasslands of Mongolia into distant regions with different climates, cultures, and military traditions, the Mongol war machine that once moved with perfect rhythm began facing invisible resistance long before swords ever crossed. Because conquering land is fast, but controlling it is slow. and the sheer size of their territories created logistical nightmares. Messengers took weeks to deliver orders, reinforcements arrived late, and commanders often had to make independent decisions without central coordination, which slowly diluted the unified precision that once defined Mongol dominance. Internal tensions also began surfacing after the death of Genghis Khan, not immediately as open civil wars, but as subtle rivalries among heirs, disagreements over succession, and regional loyalties forming around different branches of the royal family. And although the empire still appeared united from the outside, these fractures weakened strategic consistency, turning what was once a single unstoppable force into multiple powerful yet semi-independent factions, each prioritizing its own interests. Meanwhile, the conquered regions were not passive victims forever. Many rulers observed Mongol tactics carefully, learning their reliance on speed, mobility, and psychological terror, and began reshaping their own defenses, fortifying cities with thicker walls, developing counter-cavalry strategies, improving communication networks, and most importantly, forming alliances instead of fighting alone, because unity proved to be one of the few effective counters to Mongol warfare. Geography itself became an enemy the Mongols could not intimidate. Dense forests limited cavalry maneuvering, mountainous terrain slowed horse archers, humid climates exhausted soldiers and animals alike, and unfamiliar diseases quietly reduced troop strength without dramatic battles, reminding history that nature can defeat armies more efficiently than weapons ever could.
Over time, the myth of Mongol invincibility started fading not because they suddenly became weak, but because their enemies stopped believing they were unbeatable. And this psychological shift was crucial. When fear disappears, resistance becomes organized, strategies become bold, and wars transform from one-sided conquests into balanced confrontations where victory is uncertain. Trade routes that once funded campaigns became harder to secure, rebellions ignited in previously subdued cities, and maintaining control demanded constant military presence, draining resources that were once used purely for expansion, creating a cycle where the empire had to fight just to hold what it already owned, rather than pushing further outward. Leadership transitions further complicated stability, as each new ruler inherited vast territories, but also inherited unresolved conflicts, ambitious generals, and distant provinces with their own cultural identities, making centralized governance increasingly fragile. And the empire gradually shifted from rapid expansion to cautious administration, which historically signals the beginning of transformation rather than immediate collapse. Yet despite these challenges, the Mongol legacy remained immense. Their influence reshaped trade networks, connected East and West more directly than ever before, and spread technologies, ideas, and cultural exchanges across continents, proving that even as military dominance slowed, their historical impact continued evolving in different forms. What truly marked the turning point was not a single catastrophic defeat, but the accumulation of limits, stretched supply lines, adaptive enemies, environmental barriers, and internal divisions all pressing simultaneously, like cracks spreading across a once flawless shield, until the empire no longer expanded effortlessly and instead had to negotiate, defend, and manage complexity. And in that shift lies the real end of unstoppable conquest, because history shows that empires rarely fall in one dramatic moment. They transition from storms into structures, from fear into governance, from expansion into endurance. And the Mongol Empire, once the embodiment of unstoppable motion, ultimately faced the same universal law that governs all powers. Momentum can conquer the world, but sustaining it requires balance, and balance is far harder to maintain than victory.
And as decades passed, what once felt like a single roaring thunder across continents slowly became distant echoes carried by different winds, because the empire that had expanded through unmatched speed and unity could not maintain that same intensity forever, and the very qualities that made the Mongols unstoppable in conquest became difficult to preserve in governance, as ruling millions of people across vast cultures demanded diplomacy, administration, and patience rather than pure military brilliance. Provinces that were once tightly controlled began operating with increasing independence, local leaders gained influence, and the descendants of Genghis Khan ruled separate khanates that shared ancestry but not always shared priorities, turning a once centralized storm into multiple regional powers, each strong in its own territory, yet no longer moving as one unstoppable force. Trade still flowed, cultures still interacted, and the Mongol legacy remained deeply embedded in the political and economic systems of Eurasia. But the era of rapid, fear-driven expansion had clearly ended, replaced by a slower, more complex reality where maintaining borders proved harder than conquering them. Enemies who once surrendered at the mere rumor of Mongol arrival now negotiated, resisted, or strategically allied, showing that the psychological dominance had faded, and with it disappeared the invisible advantage that once won battles before they even began. Leadership disputes, generational changes, economic pressures, and the natural challenges of ruling enormous lands gradually transformed the empire from a symbol of unstoppable conquest into a collection of influential yet independent realms. And this transformation did not erase their greatness, but instead redefined it, proving that historical power is not only measured by how fast an empire rises, but also by how deeply it shapes the world long after its peak momentum slows. In the end, the Mongol story is not about a sudden fall or a single defeat that shattered everything overnight. It is about evolution, about how even the most feared empire eventually meets the limits of expansion and shifts from dominating through fear to surviving through adaptation, leaving behind roads, trade networks, cultural exchanges, and a legacy that stretched far beyond battlefields. The thunder did not vanish, it simply rolled into the distance, reminding history that no force remains unstoppable forever, yet the mark it leaves can outlive centuries, and that is how the Mongol Empire truly ended its age of invincibility, not with silence, but with transformation into legend.